probably in the time that we have, I really just about go over some of the highlights here. Just a few textual notes based on what you're seeing. I went ahead and made this sort of a study text where I combined, well, sort of combined, I integrated the Greek fragments and put them basically side by side the Coptic fragments so that you can kind of see the differences. And one of the things that I did was I highlighted where one says one thing and the other says something else. So for basically something that we have basically three witnesses for, three different, two sets of fragments and one actual manuscript or whatever, there's an interesting number of discrepancies and differences, which again, it just sort of underscores the fact that we don't really have enough of these manuscripts to really make anything definitive out of. So that just has to be said. If, for example, you look at the Greek version of versus Logion 1 versus the Coptic version of Logion 1, the words here are used are a little bit differently, but I think that they're also the way that they interplay is kind of important, because it says, for example, whoever finds the interpretations of these sayings in Coptic will not experience death, whereas in the Greek it says whoever hears these words shall never taste death. Right. So what you see is that one uses the word hears and the other one says finds the interpretation. So is this really a contradiction, or is this possibly a key to unlocking some of the nuance here? Because when Yeshua says, "Let him that has ears, let him hear," right? If both ideas are true, then hearing involves the interpretation of something, like hearing with a higher level thinking, in other words, right? So maybe there's not really a contradiction here. When you go to verse Logion 2, for example, and you see where I've highlighted where it says, "Let him who seeks not cease until he finds, and when he finds he shall wonder, and wondering he shall reign, and then again, and reigning he shall rest." That's an added statement. That's an added verse. Now, it could well be that the person who was who was writing in the Greek, it could well be that he was conflating other texts and other sayings in and among these things. Maybe this was his own personal copy for his own personal study, perhaps. So it's hard to say, but there seems to be a lot in the Greek that's added. So if we
it seems to be almost like a definition.
In a way, yeah. In a way, it's as if it's an interpretation, if you will, of these things. And it might well be. I mean, it's hard to say, but based on what we have, you can see that there are a little bit of additions in the Greek that they primarily in the Greek,
Really
as opposed to
really
the Coptic.
fleshing out. It really illuminates.
So I think that probably what's happening is that there are accretions here that are on the part of the writer of the Greek, whoever did that. Furthermore, moving to Logion 5, for example, it says, "Recognize what is in your sight, and that which is hidden from you will become plain to you, for there is nothing hidden which will not become manifest." That's nice and short and pithy, right? The Greek compiler adds a verse. It says, "Nor buried, which shall not be raised."
That's important, because I have a book, I think by Meyer, where he has the Coptic text and the English translation. Another thing, like they say, well, it doesn't mention the Passion, but it alludes to it, right? Mm-hmm. But that would be, if that verse is part of the original Gospel of Thomas, then the Gospel of Thomas did refer to the resurrection.
I'm reminded of the Amplified Bible.
Right?
But you'll notice how in Logion 6 here, I've got in black text, which is the Coptic, which is the primary one, it has a similar verse that the Greek text seems to be lacking. So it's almost as if he's moved it from one place to another. Again, buried, that shall not be raised, as opposed to covered, which will remain without being uncovered. burial and uncovering, they seem to be related in terms of, something
Well,
that's.
they're saying exactly the same thing.
Well, look at the Greek for Logian 5 versus the highlighted portion here versus the Coptic Logian 6. You see those statements are kind of parallel. So it isn't as if he's just pulling this out of the ether. It's as if he's moving some things around a little bit.
And he's a little more flowery.
Well, a little more full, yeah. And I just kind of, again, since we don't really have time to dive into the meaning, maybe we'll do that some subsequent thing. I'm just looking at some of the textual aspects of it primarily
That's good
today. Moving forward to Logian 30, for example, where there seems to be a little bit of an embellishment in the Greek. I have that labeled 30 slash verse 77 because that embellishment is something that's been added that's actually in Logian 77 in the
More
in
than
the
once.
Coptic,
Yeah.
right? Where it says, lift up, Logian 77 says, lift up the stone and you will find me there. Well, the writer of the Greek has added to Logian 30. So even though it's absent in the Coptic in Logian 30, it is present in the Coptic in Logian 77. So it's been moved, or either moved or added. We don't have the 77 that he had, but whatever. And also, if you'll notice down at 32, Logian 32, there seems to be a whole other verse that's unique to the Greek. So I just labeled it 32.5 because it's sort of like its own unique verse. But you can see why he put it there, because if you then read 33. Like, okay, the additional verse says, Jesus said, thou hearest with one ear, but the other thou hast closed, right? It relates to 33 where it says, preach from your housetops that which you will hear in your ear, right? For no one lights a lamp and puts it under a bushel, nor does he put it in a hidden place, but rather he sets it on a lampstand so that everyone who enters and leaves will see its light. So in other words, this verse he added, I guess, as a transition, between 32 and 33. In Logian 36, for example, you see where the Greek has added about what you will eat and what you will wear. He adds the part that we're familiar with as well about you are much better than the lilies which neither card nor spin. And as for your part, what will you wear when you have no clothing? Who would add to your stature? It is he who will give you your clothing, right? So that's another embellishment. And I think that's just about the last one that you add in the Greek. I sort of have an honorable mention in the Coptic where there might be an embellishment in the Coptic. If you go to the very last page in Logian 111, for example, it says, Jesus said, the heavens and the earth will be rolled up in your presence, and the one who lives from the living one will not see death. And then it sort of parenthetically seems to add, does not Jesus say, whoever finds himself is superior to the world, like as if maybe that's an embellishment. Now, it could well be that that's a... Yeah,
Cross-reference.
right. So what we're looking at here is not without its embellishments, is not without its possible relocations of text, is not without the possibility of borrowing from other texts,
But
etc.
amplification.
So, to whatever degree that, would bother somebody, I would say that those are kind of, how should I put it? There are two ways of looking at things, sort of from the outside and from the inside. And it seems like every time I come up here, I gotta kind of make that distinction. Someone who's trying to date something or categorize something, they're always gonna look at objectivity. They're always gonna say, why do we have these accretions, for example? What is the dating of these things? How reliable is the hand that wrote these things? And so, those things will lead to questions, and those things will lead to doubts, and those things will lead to, various conclusions on the parts of various people. And so those are things that maybe at first might not seem helpful. But to your point, as you mentioned before, like the very first one where it says, whoever finds the interpretations of these sayings will not experience death. In the Greek, when he just flat out says, whoever hears these words shall not taste of death, you can kind of see that hearing and finding the interpretation are related terms. So that in this particular opinion, in my particular opinion, it seems as if the one is sort of helping the other, because we want to have eyes that see and ears that hear. And so my contribution to this, I think, is to somewhat to have the ability to explain these things from the inside out and from the parabolic level. One of the things that you'll see as a theme running throughout this book, and it's very cut and dried. It's very sort of dark and light, upper and lower, inner and outward. There's a whole lot of contrast in these books, like poverty versus wealth, right? Unity versus division, right? These are the sort of the ongoing recurring themes that occur throughout this particular text. But if I've got a few minutes, I'd like to at least start kind of just breaking it down a little bit so that you get a better sense of what it is that I'm saying. There's sort of an introduction that says, these are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus, Judas, Thomas wrote down. Okay, so, and it says, and he said, whoever finds the interpretation of these things will not experience death. So here you have, basically in the compass of the introduction and the first logion, the contrast between the living Jesus and the experience, the one who experiences death. And what's the difference? The difference is that if you come to find the interpretation of these sayings, you are translated from death into life. That life is the life is the understanding of these things. The life is the hearing of these things, right? And you find this sort of echoed throughout this gospel, where Jesus talks about when he says that 24 prophets have spoken in Israel and they all spoke of you, for example, he says, well, you have ignored the one who is alive in your presence and have spoken only of the dead. So the one who is alive is the one who has the words of life, who speaks the words of life. This is something you find written in John as well. The same idea is that he has the words of life, right? And the disciples like, well, to whom shall we go? You know what I'm saying? And so that riffs off of this, right? So living is understanding and dying is not understanding. And so, in other words, if this mystery gets lost and not recovered, until the time of the end, let's say, then you go from a state of life, whoever encoded these mysteries and could explain and exposit these mysteries at the beginning of the church age, if that mystery should disappear and fall away, then all of humanity, all of Christianity basically remains in a state of death, because they're not able to interpret the understanding of these things, therefore they taste of death. So that's the first thing. Okay. The second thing is the absolute certainty that the truth is here to be found. Right? So what you're looking for is contained within this book. And so a person who is seeking the mystery, it says, let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. Right? And again, you guys were talking about how some of these verses are troubling, right? Because again, you're trying to see them perhaps
It's
on the
beginning
level of the
wisdom,
flesh,
as the
but if
word
you're
says,
able
yeah.
to then see through them with the eyes of the Spirit, through the living logos, in other words, the logos comes alive, in other words, within you, then you will be astonished. Or in the Greek, it says you will wonder, right? It'll be a marvel to you, right?
A revelation.
And in reigning, you will rule over the all. In other words, you will, in other words, instead of being under it, in other words, if you don't know something, you're sort of under its power.
You
You're
don't know
sort
what
of
you don't
subject to its effect, right? You ever found something out, late,
You know the
and then
truth
you
and it
just
set
you
you
snap
free.
out of it. You're like,
Mhm.
this whole illusion has disappeared, right? And that's what this is supposed to look like and feel like. And this is, and again, you shall reign. And the reigning is the idea that now, instead of ignorance having its power over you, instead of the power of death having a power over you, you now have power over it.
It's greater than conquering a city, like Solomon said.
And in reigning you shall rest. And why? Because you've stopped looking for it because you found it. You know, like people joke about, like, well, you know, I found it was in the last place I looked. Like, well, yeah, you're gonna keep looking
Where'd you
for it
keep
after,
looking?
you know what I'm saying? So you come to
I
rest,
said to keep looking,
right?
man.
Because you found it. So that's the second thing.
Right.
The third thing has to do with like the religious authorities, and those who talk to teach you, right? It says that those who lead you say to you, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say it is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. So in other words, if the poverty is the lack of this knowledge, right? And other people are trying to tell you, look, it's over here, or look, it's over there. And we know what the fish are. We know what the sea is, right? The fish are the different
Fishers
forms
of
of
men.
Christianity,
Yes.
right? And the birds, again, that has to do with that which is above, the powers that currently rule, in other words, right? In other words, so it's with a reference to basically the religion that then was, or Judaism. And so you see birds and fish together, and then in the same way that you see dogs and swine together, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But this is all with reference to the powers that be. And so, but if you make an end run around those people, like the Christians are going to tell you this book is baloney, right? And you know what I'm saying? Because they are asserting their own selves and their own teaching in the sea, which is basically the Christian age, as again the book makes clear as we go on. But again, he says that if you come to recognize yourselves, by coming to see the mystery, in other words, the from the within instead of from the without, right? Instead of from the outside looking in, you're able to interpret it from the inside out, in other words,
From the
right?
heart, yeah.
Then your perception of it matches what is in front of you, which is these scriptures. In other words, you see here what you understand here, and you make the two symbiotic. You see the thing and you understand it, and you understand it, and you can explain it, and you have power over the world.
It's a feedback
And so
loop.
the people, your leaders, right, don't have the ability to deceive you or to vaunt themselves in their own, ideas
Mhm.
over and above your own heart, because you become one with the logos,
Yeah.
right? It says, okay, so the man old in days, this is Logian 4, will not hesitate to ask a small child 7 days old about the place of life, and he will live. For many who are first will become last, and they will become one and the same. Well, the 7 days old, again, in 2 Peter, we see that a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are as a day. This is also reiterated by Barnabas, and also in the letter of Aristeas, and also Bartholomew talks about the day as being
Right.
1,000 years.
Right.
Right, so we have several different ancient witnesses to this idea, one of which is canonical, and so therefore people who are Christians will have a hard time explaining it away. So if you're able to use that particular interpretation, for example, the man who is old in days will not hesitate to ask a small child 7 days old about the place of life. And again, what is the place of life? The place of life is the knowledge of this stuff, right? Because whoever finds the interpretation of these things will not taste of death. Therefore, the corollary to that is if you do understand the interpretation of these things, then you experience life, because the Logos comes alive in you, right? So who is the small child? The small child is the elect, those who come at the end of the age, that is to say on the 7th day, in the 7th millennium, which is where we currently are. So if you're able to articulate that from the point of view of being an elect one, in other words, a child, like it says in the Gospel of Truth, for example, it talks about that these are the children of the Father is seeking, right? He's talking about the elect ones, right? So they become one and the same. The reason being is because if you're able to decode, like let's say you're standing at the end of time and you're able to decode something. Obviously at the beginning of time, when they were encoding this stuff, they were writing it down at the beginning, right? In order for you to decode at the end. So you become one and the same with them, because it's from generation to generation, right? It's passed along. So they become one and the same because your understanding and their understanding are the same. There is no division, and you are one. So that's, okay. And it says, again, in Logian 5, it leads into this idea. Recognize what is in your sight, and what is hidden from you will become plain to you. For there is nothing hidden that will not become manifest. In other words, there's nothing that's encoded that will not someday become decoded. In other words, nothing that was covered up with the clothing of the flesh, let's say, clothed, the heavenly treasure, if you will, clothed in earthen vessels. In other words, in plain
Notice,
speak.
I want to say, there's a lot of these statements we're looking at now do have parallel in the four Gospels, like the idea in the Gospel of Luke, the kingdom of God is within you.
Yeah.
Right? What's another one? Well, that one, there's nothing hidden which should not be made manifest. Jesus says that.
And this is part of the reason why I start with the powerful books, because those are the ones that people question. And if you can show them inspiration from these books, like in other words, if their first experience of this is from these books, right, and they get the revelation from these books that they question, and then they go over to the canonical stuff, and it opens up those books. You know what I'm saying? And now here's the stuff that you question that you can see now. And all this stuff that you didn't know to question, now you can see it over here. And so it comes alive in you. It brings you to it opens up your spiritual eyes. Because again, there's physical eyes and there's spiritual eyes. There's physical ears and there's spiritual ears. If you find the interpretation, then you hear, right? That's like the first thing you learn in this gospel, because this gospel is designed to bring you to awareness. And it says, the disciples questioned him and said to him, do you want us to fast? How shall we pray? Shall we give alms? What diet shall we observe? And this is an interesting answer. Jesus said, do not tell lies and do not do what you hate, for all things are plain in the sight of heaven. For there is nothing hidden that will not become manifest, and nothing covered will remain without being uncovered. So, and again, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. Where is it? Verse Logion 14. It's on page 2. Logion 14 is really the answer to this question. So I'm just going to jump to that real quick. Jesus said to them, if you fast, right? Remember, how shall we fast? Do you want us to fast? How should we pray? If you fast, you will give rise to sin for yourselves. And if you pray, you will be condemned. And if you give alms, you will do harm to your spirits, right? So why would he say something like that? In what way does that make sense?
counterintuitive.
Well, I want to mention something that real quick. Is Jesus did say, he criticized people fasting. Oh, don't fast like them because they disfigure their face, they go around. And Jesus, so this seems like, well, Jesus is, but there are parallels in which our Gospels, right?
Like,
he
hey, your
condemns
parents.
he condemns the way they fasted, he condemns the way they prayed, and he condemns the way they give alms, right?
The reason is, yeah, that's exactly right. The reason is because this book is about what is above versus what is below. The spiritual versus the spiritual versus the flesh, right? So, in other words, if you fast in the flesh, right, that doesn't really do any good.
Right.
And also it's the wrong approach.
Wrong.
There's a
attitude.
spiritual fasting and there's a physical fasting. There is spiritual prayer and there is physical prayer. There is spiritual alms and physical alms. Like, let me break that down. If, for example, let's just go back to the original meaning. That the very fact that structurally something is encoded, that is written in a language, a parable, right? It means that's to cover it up and to, in a sense, suppress it and to preserve it for some other time. Because the lower level and the higher level, when it talks about the two being one, when you make the two into one, right? That's when you realize that because the higher level meaning is couched in the lower level meaning, there are two things there that are from one source. The source is the word, but the word has two meanings, right? So in other words, there are two levels, right? So a spiritual fast is to give up your spiritual food. And what is the spiritual food? It's the Logos, right? It is the Word of God. So a spiritual fast would be to give up part of what we have as Scripture, part of what we have as understanding, part of the mystery, right? To give that up, right? For the sake of someone else eating it in the future, in other words. And the same thing with alms, it's a gift. To give it up for the time, for a future generation, for those who cannot pay you back in the future, right? Then that is a spiritual alms, right? As opposed to a physical alms, right? So in other words, you could give somebody all that you have, but that's only going to benefit a limited number of people for a limited amount of time. Whereas if you give up the treasure, right, for the future, right, for them to then come along at the end of time and be able to destroy everything that came before and replace it with, you know, what was known from the beginning, in other words, to undercut all of this concept of the canon, to undercut all of the teaching of the church. That's so everybody can be wrong and God can be right. And so it says when you walk in, when you go around in any, so if you walk around in the districts and they receive you, eat what they will set before you. What's the food? It's the spiritual food. So let's say somebody only accepts the 66 books, right? Well, you can start with that. You can start with Jude, for example, quoting Enoch, right? You can start with that. You can start with the food that they lay before you, the spiritual food, right? And you heal the what? The spiritually sick among them, right? Because the physical level is, you know, oh, I'm just healing the sick, which again is great, but there's a surpassing glory to that. There's a surpassing meaning to that. And it says, for what goes into your mouth, in other words, whatever spiritual food you consume, whatever is nourishment to you, in other words, doesn't defile you. But that which issues from your mouth, that is what will defile you. So the idea is that the teachings that these people bring about, based on their ignorance, based on their death.
Yeah. Robert, we have to wrap it up.
Okay.
I want to mention here, I'm sorry I went on too long earlier, but that everything in here really has parallels in what's in the gospel. Jesus said to them, if you fast, you'll raise them to yourself. Jesus condemned the way the Pharisees fast, right? When you pray, you'll be condemned. He condemned the way they pray, because they sound the trumpet in the street in front of them, and they pray. They do it to be seen by men. When you give alms, well, that's another thing, right? They're publicly giving alms and showing off. This is when you go into the land, walk around the districts, they receive you. But Jesus told that to his apostles when he sent them out, heal the sick. And also, when the disciples were taking the grain while they were going to the field, that's when he said that statement, whatever you put in your mouth, so that defile you, what comes out of your mouth. That was defiles you. So you look at this at first, like, what is he saying? And then you see, well, this is connected with what we have written in our four gospels.
And just for what it's worth, I passed out some CDs and I put some over on the table there, so hopefully if we get more people in next week, they'll be able to take them. Play them in your car, whatever.
all these materials.
There's 2 tracks on there. One of them is the Gospel of Thomas, which again, I integrated. I did an integration. That's why it sounds a little funny at times, because I integrated the Greek and the Coptic. So it's a little bit wordy at times, but you're trying to put the 2 ideas together so that they're more complete. And then I put the Agrapha as a second text, because what that is, since the Gospel of Thomas is a series of sayings, it's a sayings gospel. What the Agrapha is all the different sayings from ancient Christianity that are attributed to Jesus, what happens is when you take all of those verses and arrange them thematically, which I've done, I borrowed from a source called The Legendary Life of Christ, I believe is what it's called, from I think 1903 or whatever. And I used that as my basic structure, and I added to it, and I refined it a little bit. But it actually, because it's all in thematic order, it's actually very listenable. And the one verse leads into another, even though their sources are disparate and different. And so just listening to the Agrapha and seeing the unity of thought that's there when you put all of those sayings in context and when you put them in order thematically and somewhat chronologically, right? Listening to those words will make you feel and make you have a strong sense that there's something beyond just those words, like as if these were things that were meant to be comprehensible. And so I threw that on there because I had the space to throw it on there, but it also makes a very nice companion to the Gospel of Thomas. If you listen